High in the remote mountains of the northern Rockies lived a small, little understood, ancient people known as the Sheepeaters, or Tukudeka, whose lives were shaped by isolation, mobility, and an intimate knowledge of the land. For generations, they avoided the valleys and the conflicts that followed white settlement, leaving behind little written record and becoming easy to mislabel, misunderstood, and forgotten. When violence finally erupted in 1879, it was less a traditional war than a relentless pursuit driven by fear, accusation, and confusion over who the Sheepeaters really were. Their story is one of survival at the margins, where rumor often mattered more than truth. This episode explores who the Sheepeaters were, why they were drawn into Idaho's last Indian War, and how quickly that conflict quickly erased a way of life that had endured for centuries. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. Before we talk about soldiers, campaigns, and the events of 1879, we need to talk about who the Sheepeaters really were, and why so little is known about them. The truth is, the Sheepeaters left almost no written record of their own. What survives comes from archaeology, scattered observations by trappers and explorers, later academic work, and a handful of frontier-era stories that blur the line between memory, legend, and myth. There is an account that comes from the book, The Sheepeaters, by William Alonzo Allen, that talks about the author meeting a 115-year-old woman that explained that she was the last of the Sheepeater people. Now, that book is highly romanticized, shaped by the attitudes of its time, and almost certainly embellished, but it has endured for a reason. It captures how the Sheepeaters were remembered as a people, already fading from the world when outsiders finally noticed them. This is the story that the old woman told. We were the Sheepeaters who have passed away, but on these walls are the paint rocks, where our traditions are written on their face, chiseled with obsidian arrowheads. Our people were not warriors, we worshipped the sun, and the sun is bright, and so were our people. Our men were good, and our women were like the sun. The Great Spirit has stamped our impressions on the rocks by his lightnings. There are many of our people who were outlined on those smooth walls years ago. Then our people painted their figures, or traced them with beautiful colored stones, and the paleface calls them painted rocks. Our people never came down into the valleys, but always lived among the clouds, eating the mountain sheep and the goats, and sometimes the elk when they came high on the mountains. Our teepees were made of cedar, thatched with gray moss and cemented with the gum from the pines, carpeted with mountain sheepskins, soft as down. Our garments were made from the skins of the gazelle and ornamented with eagle feathers and ermine and otter skins. We chanted our songs to the sun, and the Great Spirit was pleased. He gave us much sheep and meat and berries and pure water and snow to keep the flies away. The water was never muddy. We had no dogs nor horses. We did not go far from our homes, but we were happy in our mountain adobe. Then came the Sioux, who killed the elk and buffalo in the valleys. They had swarms of dogs and horses and ran the game until it left the valleys and went far away. Their people were always at war and stealing horses, which was very wrong in the sight of our people, who never stole anything. Our men were fearless and brave, and could bring down all kinds of game with their bows and arrows, and were contented. But the Sioux were not contented with fighting their enemies, but came to our mountain home and began to try to ascend the trail. Our chief met them on the steep precipice, and ordered them to stop where they were, but they murmured and made signs of battle. Our people had great masses of rock as large as houses, where they could let them loose down the trail, and crush the Sioux into the earth as they were all down in a deep canyon. The Sioux stopped and began a war council, and began to paint and get ready for battle. Our chief got the great rocks ready, and then sent a runner to tell the Sioux that our people never went into the valleys, nor killed the buffalo, and that we wished to be apart from all other people. After a long council, the Sioux fired a volley of arrows at our runner, and wounded him in the thigh. He came to our chief greatly alarmed at the dreaded Sioux, as they were many. The ponies in the valley below were strange-looking creatures to us. We had never seen them before. The dogs were howling, and the valley rang with a wild war whoop. The time had come for action, and the Sheepeaters assembled at the narrow trail, headed by their chieftain, Red Eagle, with his bow 6 feet long, made from the mountain ram's horn, and bound with glue and sinew from the sheep's neck. Great excitement prevailed. The squaws and children had hidden among the rocks with all their robes and earthly possessions. The wild and savage Sioux knew no fear and were pressing up the narrow trail with war paint and feathers, their grim visages scowling in the sunlight as they came. Red Eagle, with that bravery known only to his tribe, waited until they had reached the most dangerous precipice. Then, with a great lever that had been prepared years before, he loosened the great rock from its moorings, and with one crash it sped down the canyon like a cyclone, tearing the trees from their roots and starting the rocks until the canyon became one great earthquake. The screams of the terrified Indians, the howling of dogs, and the neighing of horses were heard in one awful roar. The battle was over. The canyon was a mass of blood, and death was abhorred in the valley. Not a living thing was to be seen. Red Eagle took a horn made of red cedar and gave one long quivering blast which echoed and re-echoed through the Alps and was carried across the glaciers to every part of the mountain. Then the women and children came back and once more took shelter in their comfortable homes. Stories like this are not reliable as literal fact, but they matter. They preserve how the Sheepeaters were remembered, defensive rather than aggressive, tied fiercely to place, and unwilling to abandon their high country home. The same story offers a far more believable explanation for their disappearance: disease. According to the woman, a lost white man wandered into a Sheepeater camp, sick and covered in spots. He was cared for, bathed, and sheltered, but he died. Soon after, sickness spread through the camp. People fled into the forest carrying the disease with them. Entire lodges were left standing, full of the dead. Chiefs died, families vanished, survivors scattered into other tribes, intermarried and lost their distinct identity. Over time, the mountains emptied, the trails grew quiet, the camps rotted away under snow, rain, and wind. Whether or not every detail is true, this part of the story aligns with what we know happened again and again across the American West. Small, isolated populations were devastated by disease long before sustained military contact ever occurred. In the legend, the Sheepeaters were said to have vanished entirely, their people gone, their ways remembered only by one aging woman, and with her, the final memory of an extraordinary mountain world. But legend is only one part of the story. So what do we actually know? What survives comes from brief but valuable observations made by early fur trappers and explorers. They wrote of timid mountain Indians who had no horses, owned very little, and hunted exclusively with bows and arrows tipped with obsidian. These people spoke a Shoshone dialect, yet they were clearly distinct from the Mounted Plains Shoshone and Bannock bands who hunted buffalo, traded widely, and fought the major Indian wars of the 19th century. One of the most important observers was the fur trapper, Osborne Russell. In the 1830s, Russell encountered a small band living in what he called his secluded valley, today known as the Lamar Valley in northeastern Yellowstone. He described just over 20 people, men, women, and children, neatly clothed in deer and sheepskins, content and seemingly undisturbed by the outside world. They owned almost nothing: a worn butcher knife, a couple of useless firearms, a stone pot, and a large number of dogs used to carry their possessions. They had no horses. Their wealth was knowledge of terrain, seasons, and animals. As far as evidence of the Sheepeaters, it comes from fragments, archaeology, and later anthropological work. But together they give us a clearer picture than legend alone. A great source was from a video posted by This Is Yellowstone on YouTube. It's a film titled The Sheepeaters, Mountain Indians of the Greater Yellowstone region, done by Earth Talk Productions in the 1990s. I definitely encourage you to check it out. Has that old 90s documentary feel to it. It's great. But the Sheepeaters were part of a broader Shoshone tradition of identifying bands by their primary food source. Shoshone groups who hunted buffalo on the plains were known as Tukudeka, which translates to buffalo eaters, while river-based groups who depended on salmon were called Tukudeka, or salmon eaters. The small, isolated bands who lived year-round in the mountains and hunted Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep were known as Tukudeka, the Sheepeaters. Their isolation kept them largely invisible in the written record, but it also preserved a way of life that had changed very little over time. Archaeological evidence in and around the Yellowstone region pushes human presence back more than 11,000 years. While the record is fragile and incomplete, it strongly suggests long-term timeframes of hunter-gatherer societies in the region. Some scholars believe the Sheepeaters may have descended from prehistoric inhabitants of the northern Rockies, while others argue for a later migration north from the Great Basin. What matters more than the debate itself is what the evidence shows. According to Les Davis, the Sheepeaters were a highly mobile people who moved seasonally with remarkable precision, timing their movements to short windows when plants could be harvested and animals could be hunted. The Sheepeaters retained what can fairly be described as a Stone Age lifestyle well into the historic period. They lived in small, flexible bands because the mountains could not sustain large populations. Groups split and merge as conditions required, so someone from the Sheepeater band may join the Salmon Eater band based off resource availability. This survival strategy allowed them to quickly adapt to changing resources. Dogs, not horses, carry their goods. Wickiups and temporary camps replace permanent villages. Obsidian tools, steed-type pots and pipes, and an intimate knowledge of terrain define their material culture. In winter, they moved to lower elevations along rivers to escape deep snow and brutal winds. In spring, they returned to the high country. For thousands of years, this balance worked, until disease, displacement, and outside pressure finally fractured their small world and set the stage for what came next in 1879. After the Nez Perce War, which ended in 1877, and the Bannock War that ended in 1878, central Idaho was raw with fear and rumor. Miners, ranchers, and scattered river bar settlers wanted peace, but the region was still full of refugees, fugitives, and misunderstandings. In that atmosphere, nearly every unexplained killing or theft in the Salmon River backcountry began getting pinned on the same name, Sheepeaters. Some sources even describe hostilities beginning in 1878, while others treat 1879 as the true start of what we call the Sheepeater War. That split matters, because it shows how quickly accusation became fact on the frontier, especially in places where no one had the resources to investigate properly. One account pushes the violence back to the 17th of June, 1878, claiming Sheepeaters, possibly joined by Bannock refugees, raided ranches in Indian Valley before dawn and stole roughly 60 horses. A small civilian party pursued, crossing into Long Valley where they were ambushed near Piatt Falls. 3 men were killed, and a fourth, nicknamed Three-Fingered Smith, which will actually be our next episode, was badly wounded but survived by crawling for help. By early 1879, a new accusation became the spark that brought formal military action. Several accounts say Chinese miners were killed on Loon Creek near Oro Grande in February 1879, but even here, the record refuses to settle. The number of victims varies depending on which account is read, and responsibility was supposed rather than proven. What did happen is clearer than who did it. Military authorities treated the killings as a major alarm bell. Orders went out that once the trail was passable, a detachment should move from Boise, determine who the murderers were, and if they were Indians, apprehend them and bring them in. Soon, another set of deaths added fuel. In March or April 1879, 2 men, named Hugh Johnson and Peter Dorsey, were killed in the same broad region, their bodies later discovered when they failed to appear in town that they frequented. Concerned friends formed a small search party and found Johnson's cabin deserted, looted, and stripped of its horses. Alarmed, they returned to Warren's, gathered reinforcements, and went back to investigate more thoroughly. Nearby, they discovered the decomposed bodies of Johnson and Dorsey, both killed by gunfire, and Indian sign in the area led authorities to blame the killings on the Sheepeaters. How much of that Indian sign was really there is unclear. As so often in the West, the conclusion was already forming in the public mind. The Sheepeaters were responsible, and the army had to be called in. General Oliver O. Howard organized a campaign as a multi-pronged push into some of the worst terrain the army had ever tried to operate in. Captain Reuben Bernard led the main cavalry column out of Boise Barracks on the 31st of May, 1879. Lieutenant Henry Catley moved with mounted infantry shortly after, on the 4th of June. Lieutenant Edward Farrow led a small detachment with Umatilla Scouts that departed on the 7th of July from the Umatilla Agency in Oregon. Another contingent under Lieutenant A.G. Force later reinforced the effort. The plan was essentially to pressure the backcountry from multiple directions, find the suspected band, and force surrender or capture. But the Sheepeaters' greatest advantage was the country itself. Big Creek and the Salmon River canyons were a maze of box canyons, steep ridges, and timbered benches. Snow lingered late, delaying movement well into July. Horses and mules were punished by the climbs and rocky footing, and the army often operated without reliable maps. Meanwhile, the Sheepeaters rarely offered a stand-up fight. They avoided contact, watched from high ground, and struck only when it favored them. The first major military encounter of the campaign came in late July of 1879, deep in the Big Creek drainage, where Lieutenant Henry Catley's command finally closed in on what they believed was the Sheepeater camp. Scouts reported fresh Indian sign, horses grazing, moccasin tracks still sharp in the soil, evidence that the band was close and likely unaware of the army's approach. Despite this, the column halted for the night rather than pressing forward, a decision that would prove costly. Early the next morning, on the 29th, Catley's men broke camp and began moving down Big Creek in single file, the narrow canyon forcing them into a long, exposed column. When they reached the suspected campsite, it was deserted, abandoned in haste. Food, equipment, and supplies lay scattered, confirming that the Sheepeaters had been there only hours before. The soldiers destroyed what they found and pushed forward, but without advanced guards on the surrounding ridges, and without flankers watching the high ground, the ambush came suddenly. Rifle fire erupted from concealed positions across the creek and along the canyon walls, catching the column in a killing zone. The troops dismounted and scrambled for cover among the rocks and timber as bullets cut through the narrow valley. Two soldiers, Privates James Doyle and A.R. Holmes of Company C, 2nd Infantry, were badly wounded in the opening moments, and attempts to bring them to safety exposed more men to fire. With no clear target and no way to bring superior numbers to bear, Catley ordered a retreat back toward their previous camp. The following day, the situation worsened. As the command attempted to withdraw, the Sheepeaters struck again, this time from both front and rear, pinning the soldiers on the barren ridge overlooking Big Creek. The position offered little cover, no water, and no easy escape. For 14 hours, the troops remained trapped, unable to reach the creek below without coming under fire. The sun beat down, ammunition was conserved, and the men and animals grew desperate with thirst. It was here, according to later accounts, that the ridge earned the name Vinegar Hill, from the claim that soldiers resorted to drinking vinegar from the pack supplies to stave off dehydration, a detail repeated often, though impossible to confirm. As evening approached, the Sheepeaters fired brush and grass on the slopes, adding smoke and confusion to the troops. With daylight fading and no relief in sight, Catley made the only decision left to him. Under cover of darkness, the command slipped away, abandoning much of its pack train, equipment, and provisions in order to escape the trap. By morning, the column was moving back toward Warren's, battered, exhausted, and alive, but at a steep cost. On their way out, Catley's command was intercepted and combined with Lieutenant Albert Force's 25 men and turned back to Big Creek to rejoin the campaign. Some sources say that Catley was sent back to Camp Howard, but this does not seem to be the case, as you will hear about later on. The Sheepeaters, for their part, had achieved exactly what they intended. They had avoided a direct battle, inflicted casualties, seized valuable supplies and ammunition, and demonstrated a mastery of the terrain that the army could not match. The Vinegar Hill fight sent a clear message to the Salmon River country. This was not a band that could easily be cornered or intimidated. If Vinegar Hill proved the army could be humiliated in Sheepeater country, the attack at Rains Ranch showed how exposed civilians were once the campaign began to unravel. James P. Rains lived along the South Fork of the Salmon River, one of only a handful of settlers occupying narrow bars along the canyon floor. His small farm was hard-earned, hayfields carved out of river bottoms, supplies packed into warrens, and nearby mining camps. Rains had a reputation as a fair, respected man who never quarreled with Indians. Like many frontier settlers, Rains understood the risks of isolation, but he did not believe himself to be a target. When Catley's battered command passed through the river bars after the Vinegar Hill disaster, the soldiers warned settlers that hostile Indians were close and advised families to evacuate to warrens. Rains took the warning seriously. He moved his family to safety and waited. Days passed, no further signs appeared. With hay ready to be harvested and no word of immediate danger, Rains returned to his ranch with 2 helpers to finish the work, believing the worst had passed. On the 15th of August, as evening settled over the Rains Ranch, the men were finishing the last bale at the hay press when a single rifle shot cracked from the direction of the cabin. At first, the sound barely raised alarm. The others assumed Albert Weber was taking a shot at a grouse near the house. Then a sudden volley tore through the twilight. James Edwards, exposed on top of the press, shouted for the others to get down and threw himself into cover. It was immediately clear they were under attack, unarmed and in the open. Between the hayfield and the cabin ran a small creek, cut deep into a heavily timbered channel that dropped nearly 40 feet toward the river. Rains, Edwards, and Harry Lemhi Sarin slipped into the creek bed, whispering urgently about their next move. Staying put meant being cut off from their rifles and surrounded in the dark. Against their better judgment, they decided to make a dash for the house where their rifles were. Rains led the way as they climbed out of the creek and followed the narrow trail, which crossed an exposed point of ground. As they ran, Edwards and Cern shouted for Rains to avoid the point and stay off the trail. Rains did not. As he reached the crest, a rifle flashed. He staggered as a bullet tore through his right hip. Almost immediately, another shot rang out, striking him again and inflicting a fatal wound. Edwards and Cern saw Rains fall and heard gunfire erupt from multiple directions. Shots cracked from the right-hand slope, where Weber had begun firing from the cabin, desperately trying to keep the attackers at bay. Believing Weber had been killed and the cabin was lost, Edwards and Cern fled back into the creek canyon. There was no safety there either. They climbed, crawled, and staggered through darkness and brush, eventually scrambling up nearly 2,500 feet over rocks and scattered pines until they reached a ridge above the canyon. Exhausted, they collapsed into a thicket and slept briefly. At daybreak, they found an old trail and followed it into Warren's, arriving around 7 in the morning, stunned to learn shortly afterward that Weber had survived as well. Back at the cabin, Weber had immediately understood what was happening. He prepared to defend the house but held his fire, expecting the men in the field to return for their rifles. After dark, Rains had reached the cabin, badly wounded. Weber brought him inside, laid him on a couch, and did what he could. Rains asked for water, drank a little, and then died quietly. The attackers lit bonfires around the cabin to watch for movement. When one of the fires burned low behind the house, Weber seized his chance. He took the best rifle, crawled into an irrigation ditch lined with willows, followed it to the creek, and began a brutal climb out of the canyon. From the heights, he watched as the attackers burned the ranch building and nearby miner cabins. He estimated there were 7 assailants, though there may have been more, before disappearing into the mountains and making his escape. A volunteer party rode out to the ranch and recovered what remained of Rains' body for burial. They found the familiar signs, burnt structures, scattered belongings, and tracks pointing back into the mountains. Responsibility was placed squarely on the Sheepeaters, though, as with earlier killings, the precise identities of the attackers would never be conclusively established. What mattered in that moment was perception. The Rains Ranch attack hardened attitudes overnight. It erased any lingering sympathy for the Sheepeaters among settlers, and intensified pressure on the army to finish the campaign at any cost. To the people of Warren's and the Salmon River bars, the war had come to their doorsteps and it demanded an end. The campaign reached its most clearly documented confrontation in mid-August of 1879, along Big Creek at a place known as Soldier Bar, a narrow, barren flat hemmed in by steep canyon walls. Access to the bar was difficult even in good conditions, and there was no bridge across Big Creek. A small spring near the east end of the bar was the only dependable source of water, making the location both strategically valuable and dangerously exposed. On the 19th of August, elements of the Army's advance began making contact. Lieutenant Edward Farrow's Umatilla scouts encountered Sheepeaters several miles upstream from Soldier Bar and exchanged gunfire. The Indians withdrew up Big Creek, and the scouts followed, pushing them toward the bar. Near the spring, the scouts located a Sheepeater camp consisting of roughly 10 wickiups. The village appeared to have been occupied recently and was quickly abandoned as the scouts closed in. Searches of the surrounding rocks uncovered several hidden caches containing provisions and equipment, including items believed to have been taken during Catley's retreat from Vinegar Hill weeks earlier. While the scouts searched and dismantled the camp, Captain Reuben Bernard's main command arrived at Soldier Bar. After the area was secured, Farrow and his scouts immediately pushed up the mountainside south of the bar and continued pursuit. Bernard's troops remained behind, established camp on the bar, and proceeded to destroy the wickiups and burn the caches of food and supplies left behind by the Sheepeaters. That night passed without incident, though Indian fires were reportedly visible on the ridges above, suggesting the band was still nearby and watching the soldiers' movements. At dawn on the 20th, Bernard divided his forces. He and Lieutenant A.G. Force moved up the mountain toward higher ground, while Lieutenant Henry Catley was sent back along the trail toward the South Fork of the Salmon River to obtain additional supplies. Left on the soldier bar were the pack trains, mules, and a small contingent of guards, 7 men assigned to each train, along with civilian packers who were still loading equipment. Shortly after 7:30 in the morning, gunfire erupted from the rocks overlooking the bar. A group of Sheepeaters, concealed in the cliffs and timber above the camp, opened fire on the Packards and guards below. In the confusion, some soldiers ran toward Big Creek, while others took cover against the hillside, returning fire as best they could. A number of Bernard's men attempted to maneuver around the attackers' position, and after a brief but intense exchange, the Sheepeaters broke contact and withdrew up the mountain. One of the guards, Private Harry Egan of Company C, was struck by a bullet that passed through both thighs. When Bernard and Forrest heard the firing and rushed back down to the bar, the army surgeon, Dr. Preen, attempted to save Egan's life. Under chloroform, his leg was amputated, but the wound was too severe. Egan died late that morning around 11 o'clock, becoming the only confirmed military fatality of the soldier bar engagement. He was wrapped in a blanket and buried on the bar where he fell. After Egan's death, the troops formed a skirmish line and remained on alert through the remainder of the day and night, but the Sheepeaters did not return. The following morning, Bernard and Force again moved toward the middle fork of the Salmon River, while the camp at Soldier Bar fell quiet. The encounter marked the last serious exchange of fire during Bernard's phase of the campaign. Though the army had destroyed a village and inflicted losses, the Sheepeaters had again avoided capture, struck when the opportunity presented itself, and vanished back into the mountains, leaving the campaign stalled, the troops exhausted, and the final resolution still weeks away. By the end of August 1879, the Army's main effort in Sheepeater country had ground to a halt. Bernard's command was worn down by weeks of marching through canyon country that punished men, horses, and pack animals alike. Supplies had been lost or captured, stock was exhausted, and despite covering vast distances, the soldiers had rarely caught more than a fleeting glimpse of the people they were chasing. The destruction of camps and the death of a trooper at Soldier Bar had not produced a decisive result. With no clear path to finish the campaign before winter, Bernard requested permission to withdraw, and higher command was forced to concede that the primary phase of the operation had failed to bring the Sheepeaters in. But the war did not end there. It simply changed shape. When the larger columns pulled back, Lieutenant Edward Farrow returned to the field with a smaller, more mobile force and experienced Indian scouts. Rather than attempting to pin the Sheepeaters in open country, Farrow focused on locating camps, destroying food stores, and maintaining steady pressure as the weather began to turn. This phase of the campaign was quieter, less dramatic, and ultimately more effective. As fall closed in, escape routes narrowed and the margin for survival in the high country shrank. Sometime in late September, contact was finally made. A Sheepeater leader known as Tamanmo, also called Warjack, approached Farrow's command and indicated a willingness to surrender. Accounts differ slightly on the exact dates, but the sequence is consistent. Beginning around the 1st of October, groups of Sheepeaters began coming in from the mountains. Over the following days, more followed, until roughly 51 individuals had surrendered or been captured, including about 15 men identified as warriors. Their weapons, according to a report by Ricky L. Roberts of Weber State College, were 2 Henry carbines, 1 Sharps carbine, 1 Springfield carbine 45 caliber, 1 Springfield breechloader 50 caliber, 2 muzzleloading rifles, and 1 double-barrel shotgun. These weapons reflected the kind of fighting they had practiced, ambush and withdrawal, not pitched battle. With the surrender of the final bands in early October 1879, the Sheepeater campaign quietly came to an end. The prisoners were taken out of the mountains and transported west to Washington Territory, where they were questioned about the killings and raids that had sparked the war. According to the records, they denied responsibility for those acts. From there, the captives were moved again, this time to the Fort Hall Reservation in southeastern Idaho later that same year. Troop G, having marched an estimated 1,258 miles through what would later be called the River of No Return country, returned to Boise. No further armed conflicts between the U.S. Army and Native Americans occurred in Idaho after that campaign. For the Sheepeaters themselves, the consequences were permanent. Their occupation of the Middle Fork of the Salmon River was effectively ended. While the captured group was sent through Vancouver Barracks and then on to Fort Hall, not all were taken in. At least one small band avoided capture and continued living in the mountains of central Idaho for years afterward, though far from the Middle Fork drainage. Official reports were amended, congratulations issued, and promotions awarded. From a distance, the Army could call the campaign a success, but even contemporary observers admitted that victory came less from military force than from exhaustion. Chased all summer, deprived of food stores, and facing the onset of winter, the remaining bands had little choice but to surrender. The physical traces of the campaign soon faded from the landscape. At Soldier Bar, the camps, firing positions, and farrier work vanished under floods, wind, and time. Decades later, visitors removed artifacts without documentation, leaving little behind. Systematic archaeological work was conducted in 2010 by Michael H. Cutpin. He was able to confirm the skirmish site through recorded military cartridge casings, loaded rounds, a cavalry spur, and horseshoe nails clustered exactly where soldier accounts said the fighting and encampment had occurred. Today, the Egan Monument still stands at the east end of the bar, marking not only the grave of a single soldier, but symbolically the end of the Tukudeka presence in that country. The artifacts recovered by Mr. Cutpin now rest in the Piatt National Forest Supervisor's Office in McCall, Idaho, silent evidence of a war fought largely out of sight. Yet as the dust settled, a deeper question remained, one that historians continue to wrestle with. Were the people pursued in 1879 truly the Sheepeaters? Even participants in the campaign expressed doubt. Some described the hostiles as Bannocks, Shoshones, and Wisers mixed together. Others referred to them as outcasts from multiple tribes, Bannock, Shoshone, Paiute, Nez Perce, even Cayuse, grouped under the convenient label Sheepeater. Later scholars have suggested that the term may have carried a social meaning rather than a precise ethnic one, applied in marginal or displaced people rather than the original Tukudeka, encountered earlier in the century. Whether the name denoted low status or reflected the high reputation of mountain hunters remains debated. What is clear is that the group pursued in 1879 was not a single, unified band in the traditional sense, but a mixed collection of people already pushed to the edges of survival. In the end, the campaign removed them from the mountains, but it may never have fully answered who they really were, or how much of the violence they were blamed for was truly theirs. In an excellent article by Emmerich Barnett from Brigham Young University wrote that today, descendants of the Sheepeaters can be found among the eastern Shoshone communities on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, as well as on the Fort Hall Reservation in Idaho. In 2023, the town of Jackson, Wyoming formally recognized this history by issuing a land acknowledgement honoring the Sheepeaters and their connection to the region. Quote, "We recognize that the land we are gathering on is the ancestral homeland of the mountain Shoshone people, who stewarded it for thousands of years, and that many other tribes also lived upon and cared for this area. With gratitude, we honor indigenous peoples, past and present. We also acknowledge the sovereignty of the native nations closest to Jackson, whose land was taken through broken treaties that resulted in the creation of the Wind River and Fort Hall Indian reservations. We recognize this acknowledgement as simply a first step. The town of Jackson is committed to continued and informed action to connect with indigenous people." The story of the Sheepeaters is not one of conquest or grand battles, but of a people who tried to remain unseen in a world that was closing in all around them. Their war ended quietly, not with a decisive victory, but with exhaustion, displacement, and unanswered questions that still linger today. What happened in the canyons of central Idaho reminds us how easily fear and rumor could become justification. and how entire communities could be swept away without ever truly being understood. This was Idaho's last Indian war, and one of the least remembered, though its echoes still remain in the mountains. I hope y'all enjoyed this episode on the Sheepeaters. If you did, please give a like and maybe subscribe. And if you're listening on Spotify, give a 5-star rating and hit that follow button if you feel so inclined. All of this really helps me grow and reach new listeners. And as always, I appreciate everyone's support. If y'all haven't checked out the Spotify, please go give it a try. I have an 8-part series on both the legendary lawman Bass Reeves and the jolly mountain man, Joe Meek. Join the membership family. For just $1, you'll get access to bonus content like the Honeywell gunfight and the first stagecoach robbery in U.S. history. And as always, thank you to the membership family. You are noticed and greatly appreciated. We'll see y'all next time. And remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.